If you really want to understand what's happening in Afghanistan today, you've got to look past the 24-hour news cycle. See, underneath all that chaos you hear about, there are these deep, hidden patterns, almost like historical blueprints that have been shaping the country for centuries. So let's kick things off by tackling the biggest cliché of them all.
You've heard it a million times, right? Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires. It conjures up these images of invincible warriors, driving out every single foreign invader. But is that what really happened? Is that the whole story? Or is there something more complex, something much more interesting going on behind that famous phrase?
That whole graveyard idea? Well, historian Thomas Barfield throws a major wrench in that theory. He says, and I quote, "None of these world powers were driven from Afghanistan militarily. Rather, their governments decided it was no longer in their national interest to keep troops there." So what he's saying is, these global superpowers weren't exactly chased out with pitchforks. Nope, they packed up and left because the folks back home, the politicians, the public, decided it just wasn't worth it anymore. It was a cost-benefit analysis, a political decision, not a clear-cut military defeat.
Okay, so if we're throwing out the whole graveyard of empires idea, what are we left with? This is where it gets really interesting. Barfield's whole idea is that Afghanistan's history isn't just one chaotic event after another. He says it's actually built from these recurring pieces. Think of them like historical Lego blocks that get put together over and over again, always following a kind of predictable logic. And maybe the most important Lego block of all is best explained with this fantastic analogy. Barfield calls it the tale of two cheeses. So picture a modern state like the US or France. It's like a slice of American cheese. It's totally uniform, solid. The government's power is supposed to reach every single corner of the map. But Afghanistan? Historically, it's been run more like Swiss cheese. And here's the kicker: the ruler's power is in the cheese, not in the holes.
Right, so what does that actually mean? Well, for centuries, Afghan rulers focused all their energy on controlling the valuable parts. The cheese, right? The cities, the big trade routes, the fertile valleys where you could actually grow things and tax people. They weren't all that interested in controlling every single mountain and desert out in the holes. Why? Because it was expensive, difficult, and frankly, not worth the trouble. This created a completely different idea of what it even means to rule a country.
And that whole Swiss cheese idea perfectly sets up our next big pattern. This is a conflict that has, for the last century, defined so much of the country's turmoil. This deep, relentless clash between the modernizing, progressive ideas coming from the cities, the cores, and the super-conservative, traditional values of the countryside, the margins.
And you see this pattern play out again and again and again. So back in the 1920s, you have King Amalullah. He tries to push all these modern social reforms, and boom, the countryside explodes in rebellion. Fast forward to the 1970s, a leftist, communist government takes over in Kabul and tries to force radical changes on land ownership and society. What happens? A massive, nationwide insurgency. And then, in our own time, the conflict between the US-backed government in Kabul and the Taliban in the countryside, it's the exact same historical dynamic. It's the same play, just with different actors on the stage.
Okay, let's get even more specific now. Let's zoom in on a pattern that happens inside Afghanistan's largest ethnic group, the Pashtuns. For hundreds of years, there's been this quiet, well, sometimes not so quiet, rivalry between two huge tribal groups, the Ghilzais and the Durranis. And what's wild is how differently they think about power. And this is just fascinating stuff. On one side, you've got the Ghilzais. They're described as more egalitarian, more focused on consensus. Their leaders tend to be self-made guys who pop up when everything's falling apart. Historically, they're the ones who topple empires. Then you have the Durranis. They're the opposite, much more hierarchical, big on structure. They're the ones who traditionally build the state and run it. Power gets passed down through these established families. And you can draw a straight line from this history to today. So many of the insurgent leaders, from the Mujahideen to the Taliban, have Ghilzai roots. And the guys who tried to build the modern state, like Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani, they're Durrani.
All right, so let's recap. We've got our Lego blocks, right? We have our Lego blocks, right? We have the Swiss cheese state, we have that deep urban-rural divide, and we have the Pashtun power struggle. Now, let's put it all together and see how these patterns explain why every major foreign power has eventually packed up and gone home.
It's incredible. Once you see these patterns, you can't unsee them. Let's just run through the big withdrawals. Okay, 1842, the British get hit with this massive uprising from the margins, the parts of the country they just couldn't control. It's a classic Swiss cheese state reaction. Then, 1929, King Amanullah's modernizing government in the core, city of Kabul, completely collapses because he alienated the countryside. There's your urban-rural divide. Jump to 1989, the Soviets pull out after a brutal 10-year war against, you guessed it, a rural-based insurgency. And finally, 2021, the US leaves, and the government in Kabul, another one of these centralized cores, just evaporates the second its foreign life support is pulled. It's the same story, just a different century.
So, when you see these patterns repeating so clearly, it's pretty powerful, right? But it also leads you to a really tough question. If history rhymes this perfectly, is Afghanistan just stuck? Is it trapped in a cycle that it can never, ever break? And that question brings us to our final and honestly our most important point. Because while understanding these patterns is absolutely crucial, it does not mean the future is set in stone. History gives us context, but it's not a prison. And sometimes you find these amazing little moments in history that challenge everything you thought you knew.
Take this story, for example. It's absolutely incredible. So in the 1930s, this Pashtun leader, a guy deeply inspired by Gandhi, of all people, builds this huge, disciplined, nonviolent resistance movement. We're talking 80,000 people. Think about that. This completely shatters the stereotype of the Pashtun warrior culture we hear so much about. But it happened. It was real, and it was a powerful force.
And this brings us right back to Barfield for the final word, and it's a powerful one. He says that such a nonviolent movement could emerge and thrive in a culture that had raised revenge to a holy principle should caution anyone against believing that people or cultures are forever prisoners of the past. What he's saying here is just so important. The very fact that this massive nonviolent movement could exist and even thrive in that environment, well, it's a huge warning against thinking that any culture is just a prisoner of its past. People can always make different choices. These patterns we've talked about, they're essential for understanding Afghanistan, but they don't lock the country into one single future. They don't mean the cycle can't be broken. And so the real question left for us is, what's it going to take to finally do it?